Layla Carter had just finished a long undercover mission for the FBI, a mission that had taken all of her focus, skill, and patience. As she drove back to her office, she couldn't help but feel the weight of exhaustion in her bones. The long hours and the secretive nature of her work were draining, but she felt proud of her success. She was one of the best agents in her field, a woman who had proven time and again that she was more than capable of handling whatever the job threw at her. It was a quiet night as she made her way through a small, sleepy town on the outskirts of the city. The neon lights of a gas station caught her attention, and she decided to stop for a quick break. She was in no rush. The roads were empty, and the cool breeze of the evening felt refreshing after hours of driving. As she pulled up to the station, she noticed a few cars parked, but there wasn't much activity. It seemed like just another quiet, uneventful night. Layla parked her sleek black SUV next to the gas pump. She was a woman of color, confident, professional, and proud of the hard work that had gotten her to where she was. She stepped out of the car, her FBI badge securely hidden in her jacket pocket. She didn't always like to advertise her job to the public. Sometimes it was better to blend in. She stretched, feeling the stiffness in her legs, and started walking toward the entrance. That's when she saw him. A local police officer, Officer Tim Harris, was standing by the door of the gas station, eyeing her as she approached. Layla couldn't help but notice the way his eyes narrowed when he saw her. Something about the way he looked at her didn't sit right. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she could feel his gaze linger a little too long. "Can I help you, officer?" Layla asked, her voice calm and polite, but with an edge of professionalism. She had been in situations like this before, where people assumed things based solely on how she looked. Officer Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a step toward her, blocking her path. "I don't know," he said slowly. "You just don't look like you belong here." Layla raised an eyebrow. She had heard similar comments before, but she wasn't about to let this officer intimidate her. "I'm just getting gas," she said, keeping her tone level and respectful. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Officer Harris wasn't convinced. "You're a little out of place here, don't you think?" he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Then he motioned toward her car. "Nice car. Where you headed anyway?" Layla could feel the suspicion in his voice, but she stayed calm. She wasn't about to let this escalate. "I'm headed back to the city. I've been working all night. I just needed a break." The officer's expression didn't change. "I'm not so sure about that," he muttered, eyeing her FBI badge, which was still hidden under her jacket. Layla felt a sharp jolt of frustration but remained composed. "I'm an FBI agent. I'm just stopping for a break, like I said." But Officer Harris wasn't buying it. His face twisted in disbelief, and he took a step closer to her. "That badge looks fake," he said, shaking his head. "I think you need to come with me." "What?" Layla's voice was steady, but her heart rate quickened. She knew she had done nothing wrong, but she also knew how these situations could turn out when people made assumptions. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer's hand went to his belt, where his handcuffs were clipped. "I'm placing you under arrest," he said firmly. Layla felt the weight of the moment. She was used to handling intense situations, but this felt different. Here she was, a trained FBI agent, being arrested by a local officer who had no reason to suspect her, except for the color of her skin and his own prejudice. "Officer, you don't have to do this," Layla said, her voice unwavering. But Harris wasn't listening. He ignored her explanation and pulled out his handcuffs, clearly determined to make a scene. Layla realized that she was not going to get out of this the easy way. She needed to keep calm. If she allowed herself to lose control, things could go from bad to worse. As Officer Harris began to handcuff her, Layla's mind raced. She had to stay composed, and she had to get through this. She was confident she would, but not without leaving a mark on this small-town officer who had made the worst mistake of his career. As he pushed her toward the police car, She couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this. How many others had been wrongfully treated like this before her? How many times had she, or people like her, been judged based solely on appearances? And so, the story of Layla Carter's arrest began, an arrest that no one would forget. Layla sat quietly in the cold, dimly lit cell, her arms crossed in front of her. The metal bars of the cell felt too cold against her skin, but she didn't mind. She was used to adversity. It was part of the job. She had faced difficult situations before, but nothing like this. Being wrongfully arrested by a small-town officer for no reason other than the way she looked felt like a slap in the face. She couldn't understand why Officer Harris had done this. He had been so quick to judge her, to make assumptions about her based on her appearance. She was an FBI agent, a professional. She had done nothing wrong. Yet here she was, locked up in a small-town police station, with no one around who seemed to care about the truth. The station was quiet, almost eerily so. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Layla glanced around the room. There were a few other cells in the small holding area, but they were empty. The walls were old, cracked in places, and the floor was worn from years of use. It wasn't a place she'd ever thought she'd end up in, and certainly not under these circumstances. Officer Harris had left her there without another word. The last thing she had heard from him was a muttered remark about figuring things out. He had acted as if the situation was already settled, as if she had already been proven guilty in his eyes. The fact that she was alone gave her some comfort. There was no one else here to make assumptions about her, no one else to treat her like a criminal. It was just her, sitting in silence, processing what had happened. She had no idea how long she would be stuck here, but she wasn't about to let this break her. Despite everything, Layla remained calm. She had learned long ago how to control her emotions. Growing up, she had faced her fair share of prejudice and stereotypes, but she had always managed to stay strong, to rise above it. That's what she intended to do now. She knew she had to stay composed, to think clearly. Losing her temper would only make the situation worse. She needed to find a way out of this, a way to prove that she wasn't just some out-of-place woman driving through town. She was an FBI agent. She had rights, and she was determined to make sure those rights were respected. As she sat there, her mind began to race. She thought about her team back at the FBI office, her colleagues who had always trusted her judgment. They would be looking for her. They would be wondering where she was, why she hadn't checked in after the mission. They would know something was wrong. She knew that they wouldn't let this go unanswered. But how long would it take for them to find her? And what would they find when they did? Layla tried to focus on the task at hand, pushing the worry from her mind. She had a plan. It wasn't much, but it was something. The one thing she could rely on was the truth. She knew that when the FBI arrived, when they heard her side of the story, they would see how wrong Officer Harris had been. They would understand that this was just an isolated incident, a mistake, albeit a big one. She heard footsteps approaching and the sound of a door opening. A voice called out from the hallway, "Hey, you." Layla looked up, recognizing the officer who had spoken. It was another man, one she hadn't seen before. He looked at her through the bars, his expression unreadable. Layla stayed silent for a moment, studying him. She couldn't tell if he was a friend or just another officer who had been swept up in the situation. "I don't know what's going on here," the officer said, almost apologetically, "but you shouldn't be in here. This whole thing feels wrong." Layla raised an eyebrow. "I agree," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But it's not up to you to decide that." Officer Harris made his decision. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "I'm going to try to get you out of here. Just sit tight." Layla was surprised. She hadn't expected anyone to take her side so quickly. It felt like a small victory, a glimmer of hope. But she knew she couldn't relax just yet. She had to stay alert, stay focused. Her team was coming for her, but how long would that take? The officer left, and Layla returned to her thoughts. The silence in the room was deafening, but it gave her time to plan. She couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Officer Harris face consequences for what he'd done? Would the town even care about what had happened to her? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let this injustice slide. She would fight for her freedom, for the respect she deserved, and she would make sure that no one else had to endure what she was going through. Layla Carter was no stranger to overcoming obstacles. In fact, her whole life had been a story of resilience and determination. Born and raised in a tough neighborhood, she knew firsthand what it felt like to be underestimated. Growing up, she was often one of the few girls in a classroom full of boys, and an even rarer sight in a field of law enforcement. But it wasn't just her gender or race that made people doubt her abilities. It was the way she carried herself. She was determined to prove that no one could hold her back. Layla's parents had always pushed her to be the best. Her father, a retired police officer, had instilled in her a sense of justice from a young age. He taught her that respect was something earned, not given, and that no matter what the world threw at her, she had to stand tall and keep moving forward. Her mother, an educator, emphasized the importance of knowledge. "If you have the right tools, no one can stop you," she would say. This belief in the power of learning was one of the driving forces behind Layla's rise. As a teenager, Layla had excelled in school. Her sharp mind and ability to solve problems quickly made her stand out, but it wasn't just her academic performance that impressed people. Layla was fiercely independent and always took the lead, even in situations where others doubted her. Whether it was organizing a community event or helping friends navigate difficult situations, Layla was always there to lend a hand. Her natural leadership qualities were undeniable. But it wasn't until her high school years that Layla truly realized her passion for law enforcement. She had witnessed her fair share of injustice growing up, and she knew that she wanted to be part of the solution. The idea of working in the FBI, where she could make a real difference, inspired her to push even harder. She spent hours studying criminal justice, attending workshops, and learning from mentors who had walked the same path she dreamed of taking. After graduating from college with a degree in criminal justice, Layla's determination paid off when she was accepted into the FBI's training program. It wasn't an easy journey, and there were plenty of times when she questioned whether she was cut out for it. But with each challenge, Layla grew stronger. She became known for her sharp analytical skills, her ability to stay calm under pressure, and her unwavering sense of duty. It wasn't long before she was placed on high-profile cases, where her work earned her the respect of her colleagues and superiors alike. Layla's reputation as one of the best in the business continued to grow. She had solved cases that others couldn't, cracked codes that seemed impossible, and uncovered truths that many wished had stayed hidden. But even with all her success, Layla never forgot where she came from. She stayed grounded and always reminded herself of the lessons her parents had taught her. That no matter how high you climb, you must always be humble and never lose sight of the bigger picture. As she worked her way up the ranks at the FBI, Layla became a symbol of what it meant to break barriers. She knew that she was a trailblazer in many ways, but she never let the attention go to her head. She understood that her role was about more than just her accomplishments. It was about paving the way for others who came after her. She wanted to show young women, especially those from underrepresented communities, that they too could achieve greatness in fields that were often seen as out of their reach. But as much as Layla had accomplished, she knew that there would always be challenges. There would always be people who judged her for who she was, not what she could do. It was a reality she had faced throughout her life. She had encountered subtle forms of prejudice during her career, but she had always pushed through. Whether it was in meetings, during investigations, or in day-to-day interactions, Layla was used to people questioning her capabilities simply because of the color of her skin. But she wasn't afraid of these challenges. In fact, they only made her more determined. Layla had spent years developing the mindset that nothing would stop her. Not ignorance, not doubt, and certainly not someone's narrow-minded assumptions. Every challenge was just another opportunity to prove them wrong. Now, sitting in that cold cell, Layla found herself facing yet another challenge. She had been arrested, wrongfully, by Officer Harris, a man who had judged her before even knowing her name. But Layla wasn't about to let this setback define her. She had worked too hard and come too far. The truth would come out. It always did. And when it did, Layla would be ready to fight for the justice she knew she deserved. Just like always, she would rise above. The next morning, Layla could feel the change in the air. The silence that had surrounded her the night before now seemed charged with tension. She had no idea how long she'd been in the small holding cell, but it felt like hours had passed. She had been calm, waiting, observing, and thinking. Every second in that cold cell had only strengthened her resolve. The officers who had treated her unfairly would soon realize their mistake. She wasn't just a woman they could dismiss. She was an FBI agent, and she would not be ignored. Just as she was beginning to wonder when someone would come for her, the door to the holding area creaked open. Layla sat up straighter, alert. It wasn't Officer Harris. This was someone else. Another officer, a woman this time, stepped into the dimly lit room. She had an air of authority about her, and Layla noticed that her uniform was slightly more polished than the others. "Are you Layla Carter?" the woman asked, her voice soft but firm. Layla nodded. "Yes, I am, and I need to speak to someone in charge." The officer looked at her with a sympathetic expression, but Layla could tell that her sympathy was mixed with professional curiosity. "I'm Officer Sanchez. I'm here to make sure things are handled correctly. You're not supposed to be in here." Layla's heart lifted. She knew she wasn't supposed to be in that cell. She knew it was all a mistake, and now it seemed that someone was finally going to fix it. "I'm glad to hear that," Layla replied, her voice calm. "I was arrested without cause, and I need to make sure my side of the story is heard." Officer Sanchez nodded, her expression serious. "I'm going to get you out of here, but we need to go through the right channels. We'll call the FBI, get your supervisors involved, and make sure everything is cleared up." Layla could hardly believe her ears. She had hoped someone would step in, but hearing it from an officer gave her a sense of relief. "Thank you," Layla said simply. "I appreciate it." Before Officer Sanchez could say more, Layla heard another set of footsteps approaching. She turned her head, and this time, the door swung open to reveal a man in a suit. Layla immediately recognized him as her FBI supervisor, Agent Collins. His serious expression told her everything she needed to know. He had come to handle the situation. "Agent Carter," Agent Collins said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of concern. "We've been made aware of what happened here. This is unacceptable." Layla stood up, feeling the sense of both relief and urgency. She had always known that her FBI team would back her up, but seeing them in person made it real. "I'm ready to go, sir. This has gone on long enough." Agent Collins turned to Officer Sanchez. "Thank you for your help, officer. We'll take it from here." Officer Sanchez nodded and stepped aside, allowing Agent Collins to lead Layla out of the holding area. As they walked through the small, outdated station, Layla couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She had been wronged, but now the wheels were in motion to make things right. They passed through the main office, where a few officers were seated at their desks, looking up as they walked by. Layla caught the eye of one officer who had been present the night before, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. The tables were turning. As they reached the front door, Agent Collins stopped and turned to Layla. "You've been through a lot, Agent Carter, but I need you to stay focused. We're going to make sure this is handled properly. We'll have a full investigation." Layla nodded. "I know. I trust the team to do what's right." Agent Collins gave her a small smile. "We won't let this slide. You've earned your place in this field, and no one is going to take that away from you. Let's make sure Officer Harris understands that." Layla felt a spark of determination in her chest. She had worked too hard to get to where she was to let one ignorant officer erase her career. "I'll be right behind you, sir," she said confidently. They stepped out into the fresh morning air. The town, once quiet and ordinary, now felt different to Layla. She had become part of something bigger than herself, a symbol for what needed to change, not just in this small town, but everywhere. As they drove back to the FBI headquarters, Layla couldn't help but think about how many people had experienced the same kind of prejudice she had faced. She was fortunate. She had the resources and the team to help her through this. But what about the others? Layla was determined to see this through, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been unjustly treated. This wasn't just about a small-town officer making a mistake. This was about showing the world that things needed to change. And Layla Carter was ready to lead the charge. Layla sat back in the FBI vehicle, feeling a mixture of relief and anticipation. The small-town police station was now far behind her, but the events of the past few hours weighed heavily on her mind. It wasn't just about the wrongful arrest anymore. It was about what this situation could mean for the future. The injustice she had faced needed to be addressed, not just for her, but for anyone who might experience something similar. Agent Collins sat beside her in the front seat, his hand steady on the wheel as he drove toward the FBI office. Layla could feel the power of the moment. The team she trusted most was now involved, and everything would be handled with the seriousness it deserved. "How long do you think it'll take to resolve this?" Layla asked, breaking the silence that had hung between them since they left the station. "Not long," Agent Collins replied. "We're already in the process of gathering evidence and speaking with witnesses. It won't be hard to show that Officer Harris made a mistake. The bigger question is how we can make sure this doesn't happen again." Layla nodded. She had always known that part of her job was about solving the problem at hand, but another part was about preventing future issues. It was about creating a lasting change, not just fixing the immediate problem. As they approached the FBI building, Layla couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort. It was a place where she knew she was respected, where the truth mattered more than appearances. Here, she didn't have to worry about people doubting her based on her race or background. They valued her for her skills, her mind, and her dedication. Once inside the building, Agent Collins led her straight to a meeting room. Several other agents were already there, their expressions serious as they began reviewing the details of the incident. Layla felt a rush of appreciation for her colleagues. They understood. They knew how hard she had worked to get to where she was, and they wouldn't let this situation undermine everything she had achieved. Agent Carter, Agent Davis, another senior officer, said as he stood to greet her, "We've been reviewing the case, and we're already contacting the local authorities. This won't go unnoticed." Layla smiled, feeling the weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just about getting out of the small-town jail. It was about the support of her team, the people who had her back. "I'm glad to hear that. Officer Harris doesn't know who he's dealing with." "We'll make sure he does," Agent Collins added. "The investigation is already underway. We'll be in contact with local law enforcement, and the town's mayor has agreed to cooperate. This is serious." As the meeting continued, Layla felt a growing sense of determination. She had faced obstacles before. This was just another one in her journey, but she wouldn't let it define her. She would use this as an opportunity to shine a light on the flaws in the system. This wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. It was about exposing the bias that still existed in many places and working to change it. Layla's thoughts were interrupted when a new agent entered the room, holding a phone in his hand. "Agent Collins," he said, "it's the mayor. He wants to speak with you." Her thoughts were interrupted again as Agent Collins returned, his face a little more serious than before. "The mayor is fully on board. He's already informed the local station to suspend Officer Harris while the investigation takes place. He understands the gravity of the situation." Layla's heart skipped a beat. This was a good sign. The local authorities might not have acted swiftly before, but now that the FBI had stepped in, they had no choice but to follow the proper procedure. This wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that those who had wronged her understood that there were consequences. "Good," Layla said, her voice steady. "Now we need to make sure it doesn't happen again." Agent Collins nodded. Exactly. We're going to make sure that the town, and every law enforcement officer in it, understands that we're watching. This is just the beginning. As Layla sat there, surrounded by her team, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were going to take action. This wasn't just about a personal grievance. It was about fairness, equality, and making sure that every citizen, regardless of who they were, was treated with respect. "I'm ready to get started," Layla said, her voice firm. "Let's make this right." The team nodded in agreement. They had her back. And together, they were going to make sure that Officer Harris, and anyone else like him, understood that this kind of injustice would not go unchallenged. The FBI was ready to make things right, and Layla was ready to lead the charge. The news spread quickly. The small-town police station that had wrongly arrested Layla Carter was now at the center of a growing storm. It wasn't just about one officer making a mistake anymore. This was about exposing deeper problems within the local law enforcement and ensuring that the mistakes made would not be ignored. The media had picked up the story, and reporters were camped outside the FBI building, eager to hear more about what had happened. Layla, however, wasn't concerned with the cameras or the headlines. She was focused on one thing: making sure Officer Harris and anyone else involved in this incident faced the consequences of their actions. She had spent years building her career with integrity, and she wasn't about to let a single person's prejudice undo that. At the FBI headquarters, Layla sat in a conference room with Agent Collins, Agent Davis, and other senior officials. They were reviewing the case, going over the details, and preparing for what came next. "Agent Carter," Agent Collins began, his voice calm but serious. "We've spoken with local law enforcement, and they've assured us that they're taking this seriously. Officer Harris has been suspended pending the investigation." Layla nodded. She knew that suspension was just the first step. What mattered now was whether they would follow through with a thorough investigation, one that would hold everyone accountable for their actions. "And the mayor?" she asked. "He's been cooperative," Agent Collins replied. "He's also made it clear that any officer found guilty of misconduct will face the consequences. The town is already working on a new diversity and anti-bias training program for the entire police department." Layla felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't just about her now. This was about making sure that this kind of thing didn't happen again, to her or anyone else. The town was taking steps, albeit slowly, to correct the problem. And Layla would make sure they didn't stop there. Agent Davis, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "We're working on that. We've already begun gathering evidence of a pattern of discrimination in the local force. We've spoken with several residents who have had similar experiences with Officer Harris and others." Layla's heart sank as she realized just how deep the issue ran. This wasn't an isolated incident. There were more victims, more people who had been unjustly treated. She had suspected that this was more than just one bad officer, and now it was becoming clear. "We'll keep digging," Agent Collins assured her. "We'll make sure that every stone is turned. We can't let this go unchecked." Layla was grateful for the support, but she knew the real work was just beginning. The next few weeks would be crucial. They had to gather as much evidence as possible, ensure that the investigation was thorough, and make sure the entire town knew that things would not go back to the way they were. It wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about reforming an entire system. Layla knew that true justice would require more than just holding Harris accountable. It would mean making sure that the law enforcement in that town, and others like it, would change for good. Through all of this, Layla stayed calm and professional, even as the pressure mounted. She knew that if she let her emotions get the best of her, the story would be about her anger, not the problem at hand. She didn't want to be seen as someone who had been wronged. She wanted to be seen as someone who had fought for what was right, for everyone who had been unjustly treated. The investigation gained momentum. People who had been silent for too long began to speak up. Residents shared their stories of how they had been treated by Officer Harris and others. Some feared retaliation, But many found the courage to step forward because they knew that this was their chance to make a difference. It wasn't long before Officer Harris' reputation started to crumble. He was no longer seen as just a single officer who had made a mistake. He was part of a pattern of misconduct that couldn't be ignored. The FBI, along with local authorities, continued to build their case. Layla knew that the process would take time, but she was patient. She had spent years working for the FBI, and she had learned that justice wasn't always quick, but it was worth fighting for. As the weeks went by, Layla felt a growing sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wrongly judged, everyone who had been overlooked, dismissed, or ignored. This wasn't just about one officer. It was about making sure that no one else would have to face the same injustice she had experienced. And with each new piece of evidence, Layla was one step closer to making sure that change would come. The fight wasn't over, but it was moving in the right direction. The days following the arrest were filled with non-stop work. Layla knew that the only way to make a real impact was to stay focused, to gather the evidence that would prove Officer Harris's actions were not just an isolated mistake, but part of a deeper issue. She was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. Layla was back at the FBI headquarters with her team, reviewing the latest reports and talking to witnesses who had come forward. The more they dug into the local police department, the clearer it became that there were serious issues. Officer Harris wasn't the only one who had made mistakes. There was a pattern, and it stretched far beyond just one officer. Agent Collins and Agent Davis were both fully on board with the investigation, and they worked closely with Layla every step of the way. They had begun interviewing other residents of the town, asking them about their interactions with the police. Many of them had stories to share, stories about feeling judged or unfairly treated because of their background or appearance. These weren't just small misunderstandings. These were moments where people had been treated with disrespect and suspicion without reason. "We've got more witnesses coming forward," Agent Collins said one morning as they sat around the table, sorting through the new information. "People are starting to feel safe enough to speak up. This isn't just about Officer Harris anymore. This is about a culture of bias that needs to be addressed." Layla nodded. "I knew it wasn't just one bad officer. We need to make sure this is seen for what it is, a systemic problem." Agent Davis looked up from his notes. "There's a lot to sift through, but we're making progress. More and more people are coming forward with similar experiences. This town's police department has a history of discriminatory practices that can't be ignored." Layla felt a sense of both frustration and determination. She had been through enough to know that real change didn't come easily, but she also knew that with the right evidence, they could force it to happen. This wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about changing the way things were done in this town, and possibly in other places as well. As the investigation continued, Layla spent hours in meetings, speaking with residents, reviewing documents, and organizing all the information they had gathered. It wasn't easy. Many of the people they interviewed were hesitant to speak out, afraid of the consequences. But as the case grew stronger and more people joined in, others began to feel empowered. They realized that they weren't alone in this, that their voices mattered. One afternoon, a breakthrough came. A local school teacher, who had witnessed several troubling interactions between the police and students, came forward with a stack of written accounts. These were not just hearsay. These were detailed, personal accounts of the way certain officers had treated people unfairly. The teacher had kept a record over the years, knowing that something wasn't right, but never having the courage to speak up until now. "We've got the smoking gun," Agent Davis said as he looked over the teacher's records. "This is the kind of documentation we need." "We need to get these documents into the right hands," Layla said. "This is the kind of evidence that will make a difference." Over the next few days, the team worked hard to organize everything they had gathered. They put together a comprehensive report, carefully outlining the patterns of bias and unfair treatment in the police department. It was clear that the problem went deeper than just a few bad apples. There were systemic issues that needed to be addressed at every level. The investigation was no longer just a local matter. It had become a case that had the potential to spark change on a much larger scale. Layla knew that the media would be watching, and that the town's response would set a precedent for how other places would handle similar issues. This was bigger than just her. This was about making sure that no one else would have to face the kind of injustice she had. By the end of the week, they were ready to present their findings. They had gathered enough evidence to move forward, and Layla felt a sense of pride in the work they had done. It had been a long, difficult process, but it was worth it. Layla stood up, looking around at the team. "We've done everything we can. Now it's time to make sure the right people hear this and take action." Agent Collins smiled at her. "You've done an incredible job, Agent Carter. The truth is out, and now we have to make sure it doesn't get buried." Layla nodded. She had always known that finding the truth was just the first step. Now they had to make sure it was heard, and that it led to real change. The work wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Layla felt like they were on the right path. The day of the official announcement had arrived. Layla stood in front of a large crowd of reporters and local officials, the weight of the past few weeks resting heavily on her shoulders. She had known this moment would come, but it still felt surreal. The investigation was over, and now it was time to present the findings. It was the culmination of so much hard work, patience, and determination. Agent Collins, Agent Davis, and the rest of the team stood beside her, their faces serious but supportive. Layla had grown to rely on them, not just as colleagues, but as friends who had helped her fight for what was right. She had been through a lot, but standing here now, she knew that all of it had been worth it. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones poised. Layla took a deep breath, preparing to speak. She had always been good under pressure, but today felt different. This wasn't just about her career or even the town. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice, equality, and ensuring that no one else would have to face the same unfair treatment she had. "Thank you all for being here today," Layla began, her voice steady and clear. "As many of you know, over the past few weeks, the FBI has conducted a thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Harris and other members of the local police department. What we've uncovered goes beyond just one officer's mistake. It is a pattern of bias, unfair treatment, and discrimination that has been allowed to fester in this town for far too long." The room grew quiet as the reporters listened intently. Layla could feel their eyes on her, waiting for the next part of the story. She continued, her tone firm but calm. "We've gathered evidence, spoken with residents, and reviewed countless records. The truth is undeniable. Officer Harris's actions were not an isolated incident. There is a systemic issue within this department that must be addressed. We are not here to simply punish one officer. We are here to ensure that real change happens, so that no one else has to face the kind of injustice that I, and so many others, have experienced." Layla paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. She could feel the weight of what she was saying, but she knew it was necessary. This wasn't just about retribution. It was about creating a future where people were judged by their character, not the color of their skin or their background. "We've worked closely with local leaders to ensure that the necessary steps are taken," Layla continued. "Officer Harris has been suspended, and a full review of the department's practices is underway. The town has already agreed to implement new training programs on diversity, inclusion, and anti-bias education for all officers. These are just the first steps, but they are important ones. We will continue to work with the community to ensure that these changes are not just implemented, but sustained." The reporters began to murmur among themselves, their pens flying across their notebooks. Layla could see the shift in the room. This wasn't just a story about one person's arrest. It was a story about systemic change. The reporters weren't just interested in the scandal anymore. They were interested in the solution. "Change is never easy," Layla said, her voice softening slightly. "It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a commitment from everyone involved. But I believe that with the right support, we can make this town a better place for everyone. We can set an example for other communities to follow. I'm proud of the work we've done, but this is just the beginning." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the reporters and local officials. She could see the realization starting to spread. This wasn't just a local issue. This was a larger conversation about fairness, accountability, and equality. The attention this case was receiving had the potential to make a real difference, not just here, but in other towns and cities across the country. As Layla finished speaking, the room erupted in questions. Reporters wanted more details about the investigation, the changes that were being made, and what the future held. Layla answered each question with the same calm professionalism she always brought to her work. She knew that this moment wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what she had. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, Layla felt hopeful. This was just the beginning of something bigger than herself. She had helped start a conversation, and she would continue to fight for justice, no matter what came next. As Layla left the room, surrounded by her team, she couldn't help but smile. This was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. Change was coming, and she had been part of making it happen.